if it works, which I have not done before. And then I'm going to start recording here. And then I'm going to share my screen. Oop, I don't want that. All right, we're almost through there. Okay. So welcome everyone to Actionable Innovations. I am Lucy Gray and your co-host for this afternoon's talk. We are excited to have you here. This is a group of people interested in educational innovation who meet every Friday. We also have a Slack channel and do other things. And if you're interested in getting involved, you can contact me later. Can you see my screen, Don? Is it sharing? Am I sharing? Okay, I'm not sharing it. Great. I'm technologically challenged today.
I was there for a minute.
Yeah, there we go. Here we go. Okay, and our intention here is to build an inclusive professional learning community in the age of the pandemic, where we hope to bring people together and to get people reconnected and to help others build their professional learning communities or their professional learning networks. And so we do it through several things. We host conversations, we write about educational innovations, and we support education leaders to kind of think differently about what is going on in the world of education. We also hope to one day provide consulting services, but that's a little bit further down the road. In the meantime, we are actually combining forces with another group that I formed a number of years ago called the Global Education Conference. We're going to be joining forces with that community in April and becoming Actionable Innovations Global. So that's what we do. And if you want to get more involved with us, we'd love to have you, but it's really kind of an informal group right now. We're just kind of getting started with our work. If you want to follow us, you can come to Linktree /ActionableInno, and all of our social media accounts are there, including YouTube, Facebook, and that sort of thing, where you'll find the recording of this session later on. And then again, this is my email address if you'd like to get in touch with me and learn more about what we're doing behind the scenes. We'd love to have you if you're really interested in building your professional learning network and contributing to the greater good of all educators. So today we're lucky to have Gary Steger share his work with us. Gary has come into some of my graduate classes I've taught over the years and always been inspirational and fun in terms of sharing his work with us. You may know Gary from Twitter. You may know him from Constructing Modern Knowledge, the conference that he co-runs, and his publishing company. And you might know his book, Invent to Learn, which has been a bestseller in numerous languages around the world. He is known for much more than that, and I'll let him tell you more about himself in a minute. But you can find him on Twitter at twitter.com/Gary Steger if you want to follow him. And we're happy to have you here, Gary. And as I said to you, when you sent me this picture, I love this picture. Where did it come from?
That was
Where were you?
I was at the Lego house in Billund, Denmark, as part of the Lego Ideas Conference a few years ago, which was remarkably devoid of ideas, but it was fun nonetheless. What was less fun was sitting on all of that Lego, as one might imagine, and getting out of the pit was even worse. I would love to. I would have loved to have taken a photo better, but yeah, it's great. It was a good day.
It's a great photo. So we're really glad to have you here, and I'm going to turn you over to Don now for a minute, and Don is going to share the history of the Proust questionnaire, and then he's going to stymie you with some questions.
Oh, wow.
Take it over. Okay. Go for it, Don.
Okay. Hey, Gary, thank you for coming on the show today. We're excited, and welcome everyone else to Actionable Innovations, where we like to end the week on a good note, and that's what this is about. So for those of you that haven't been on the show before, the Proust questionnaire is a set of questions answered by the French writer Marcel Proust. And they're sometimes used, these questions, by interviewers today. Proust sort of answered these questions in the form of a confession book album, which was a form of parlor game in Victorian times. And I got to learn about them in Vanity Fair magazine. And interestingly, this month's Vanity Fair is Proust Day, a countryman of mine, Kenneth Branagh, which I'm excited about. I haven't read them yet. And as you guys probably know, Kenneth just released a semi-autobiographical movie called Belfast, which I haven't seen. I don't know if anyone in the audience has. I've heard it's amazing. But interestingly, we were brought up in Ireland at the exact same time because we're around the same age. But Kenneth was brought up in Belfast and I was brought up in Cork. So in other words, Kenneth was brought up in the middle of a war. And I was brought up in what I call the California of Ireland, where it's away from everything else. And so we would have very different experiences of what it would have been like to be brought up in Ireland in the 60s and 70s. So I'm very curious to see it and compare it. But anyway, without that big long-winded introduction, Gary, what I've done is that I've taken the Proust Questionnaire and I've adopted it for educators. So here we go. I'll have 4 questions for you. So question 1 is, what educator do you most identify with?
Well, if I can cheat a little bit on that, I'll give you a fairly obvious one and a less obvious one. I aspire, and I spend the greatest part of my life concerned with keeping the ideas of my friend and mentor, hero Seymour Papert, alive. So certainly Papert is in there, and my new book is based on sustaining his legacy. But I think that if the teacher I most admire, educator I most admire, I'm going to say a guy named Bob Prail, who was my 7th grade social studies teacher. And every 12-year-old who was fortunate enough to be in Mr. Prail's class knew that there was something special going on, and knew that at any moment we might have to march on the district offices to keep Mr. Prail's job, because Mr. Prail put our interests and needs and talents and expertise and curiosity and competence ahead of some arbitrary list of stuff. We didn't use textbooks in his class. In the early 1970s or mid 1970s, we bought Uncle Tom's Cabin with our own money, and another class bought Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and we made films based on those books that weren't on the approved list. And Prail was quite extraordinary. And a few years ago, he retired, and I flew cross country to surprise him. And I walked into his classroom, and the kids were deeply engaged in some elaborate project where they were writing historical fiction around superhero characters in history, and they were making large puppets, and they were going to be presenting these stories at the local elementary school. And Prail introduced me to the other kids in the class, and then they went back to their work, and they were working on these interesting projects. And after a few minutes, before the bell rang, he interrupted the children, and he said, "I'm really sorry to interrupt you." And the kids sort of perked up to pay attention. And he said, "But I have a problem." And as soon as he said, "I have a problem," the kids sort of leaned in. He said, "Yeah, the problem is we're all reading Elie Wiesel's novel Night, which I'm so glad that you each bought a copy of because the district doesn't provide them. And I've been really impressed by the maturity of the conversations that we've been having, the depth of feeling and emotion you're bringing to these historical, painful topics. But the district wants me to finish chapter 11 by the end of the week. So this is what I've decided to do. I'm going to give you an enhanced study guide for the chapter." And a little girl raised her hand and said, "Mr. Prail, what's an enhanced study guide?" And he said, "Oh, if you remember, the last chapter I gave you a study guide which had all the questions that were going to be on the test. The enhanced study guide has all the questions and all the answers." And without skipping a beat, the kids said, "Okay," and they went back to working on their projects. And I can't help but think there's going to be some moment of trauma or difficulty or controversy, some obstacle, some bug that gets in the way of one of those kids 20, 25, 30 years from now. and they remember that there was some adult who cared enough about them to put them ahead of the Chapter 11 test. So I would say Bob Prale, and then the obvious person would be Seymour Papert, who I think is probably the most important educational thinker of the last certainly half century, if not longer.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Gary. I know someone in the audience will totally appreciate this, Tracy, because her and I often joke about flashcards. Right, Tracy?
Oh my God, flashcards. Like, who knew they were so, who knew what they even were?
Who knew they were timeless?
Well,
Exactly.
fortunately, I either didn't ignore the fact that there were flashcards existed when I went to school, or we didn't have them. And I really think we didn't have them because I didn't know what they were.
Yeah. Well, but they're really just a physical manifestation of instructionism.
Oh yeah, of course.
They're just a physical manifestation of you need to memorize a whole bunch of stuff.
Which
all of your systems had plenty of.
Yes.
You want to see my flashcard? Right here.
Yeah.
That's it, right here. There's my
Okay,
flashcard.
next question.
Yeah, so, okay, Gary, next one is, what words or phrases do you most overuse?
I've been playing a lot of tennis lately, so there's been a lot of swearing. I think kid, because that's my focus, but again, to sort of bend the rules a little bit, I'm really deliberate in the language that I use. So a lot of people think I'm a contrarian or I do it for effect, but I find that there are certain words that are popular in education that have lost any meaning or their currency, or have been sort of taken to a dark place where they can no longer be remediated. And I really try very hard not to use those words at all.
Right. Yeah, I hear you. Yeah. Yeah, my most overused word is amplify. I don't know where I discovered it, but it's used a lot. But anyway, okay, Gary, question 3. What talent would you most like to have?
Well, I spent a large part of my early life aspiring to be a jazz musician until my conspicuous lack of talent caught up with me. And one of the great gifts of my life is that I've not only been able to know and work with most of my educational heroes, but I've been able to spend time and get to know a lot of my musical ones as well. And I marvel at the fact that at 18, 20, 22 years old, I was arrogant or dopey enough to think that I could ever do what Branford Marsalis does, or Brian Lynch, or Jimmy Heath, or Barry Harris, or Herbie Hancock, who I heard the other night. That my career of thinking about thinking now puts me in a position where I understand just how awesome what they do is, and how far beyond the reach of my talents it actually is. So that level of technical perfection and creativity and ingenuity and beauty and swing and harmonic understanding and coming together is just extraordinary to me. So that's what I would like to be able to do. But I'm proud of the fact that I decided a long time ago that the world didn't need any more bad musicians, and I just support it in every way that I can, and amplify it, if you will.
Right. Thanks, Gary. So last one. What is your favorite hero of fiction? And audience, you can put it in the chat. We'd love to hear yours as well.
Oh, what's the? I can't believe I can't remember this. Who? The Greek myth of rolling the rock up the hill.
Sisyphus.
Yeah, Sisyphus. I'll say Sisyphus.
Okay.
But since you're probing, I will say that and my partner Sylvia Martinez will attest to this. She once said that I was narrative impaired. I'm one of those kids who didn't read any fiction in school and don't read a lot now. And so it would be another thing that I admire and wish I was better at. But I find nonfiction enough, if you will. So yeah, I would say Sisyphus.
Sisyphus. Okay. Yeah, I'm a 99% nonfiction reader as well, Gary. So that's good to hear. So Gary, thank you for letting me Proust questionnaire you, and hoping we might see some other of your responses in the chat, guys. Anyone else in the audience? But thanks again, Gary and Lucy. I'm moving it over to you.
Okay, so I'm back here, and I wanted to start out. I'm going to take Don off spotlighting here. That's my role here, and put the spotlight on Gary. Gary, I know that you're not fond of the word innovation, so I want to get to that eventually, because that's a theme that we've been exploring here. And but in general, I think it's really good to check in around how you're doing, how the pandemic has treated you, what have been some lessons learned for you personally, and where do you see teachers particularly right now in terms of coping with this new world? I'd be really curious to kind of check in and see where you've been, where you think we're going, what you're observing right now.
Prior to the pandemic, I was quite optimistic, and I wrote a number of articles with the word optimism in the title, and was talking about the fact that for the first time in last month was my 40th anniversary of working in education, which makes me slightly old, but not as old as you'd think, because I actually got my first job teaching kids and soon after teachers when I was 18 and a half years old. I was working in places that were really trying to do the right thing for kids, that were serious about the entire school structure being built around meaningful projects, that were going multi-age, that were getting rid of grades, that were looking at kids being engaged in meaningful work. And when I'd work at those schools, I'd find it incredibly exciting and invigorating. And then I would get in a rental car at the end of the day to drive back to my hotel and sort of realize that no one knew how to do any of this. And now we were building a plane while flying it, but I have a fair amount of clarity, if I'll be arrogant about that, about what to do. I've been in a number of situations over my career where we've done the impossible. We built a school inside a troubled prison for teens where Amnesty International was accusing the state of Maine of torturing children, that set out to be better than any private school you could send your kids to, where kids could work 5 hours a day on purposely meaningful projects, anything they were interested in. And we had kids who would go from not having been in school since 5th or 6th grade to being incarcerated to college after they left us. I mean, there was crazy stuff happening that I've been, I worked in the first laptop schools in 1990, where we gave every kid a computer, and all of their teachers used them, and they used them to program across the curriculum. I've been involved in online collaborative projects since the 80s. I created Pepperdine University's online master's degree program in 1997, 1998, that was built around not the delivery of information or making education cheaper or more efficient, but creating greater opportunities for collaboration and cooperation and creativity and conversation and community. So at this point in my career, in my life, I think I have some ideas about why things need not be as they seem and how we can do things differently. Then the pandemic hit. And I think educators had really good instincts at the beginning. They just sort of ran for the hills and decided that their primary mission was to take care of one another and make sure the kids were okay. And I'm on the record saying, May, June of 2020, to any teacher who would listen, don't go to any meetings this summer. Take care of yourself, relax. Again, continue to trust your instincts, live your values. Nothing good can come from a bunch of meetings. And boy, was I ever right. And boy, did I underestimate how truly terrible education could be. And a lot of people would think I was a cynic and a skeptic before that. But we use technology to double down, triple down, quadruple down on the most primitive impulses of policing children and transmitting information, and invented things like, Zoom detention, which is a thing. If you don't behave, or if you don't love Zoom enough, we'll give you more Zoom. And we were worried about what kids were wearing below the waist when they were doing Zoom school. We thought it was a good idea to have 5-year-olds who are only months away from soiling themselves, staring at a stranger on a screen all day. And I think we've just participated in a mass suicide event that's going to be very difficult to recover from. And I think that a lot of the fist shaking and CRT hysteria and anti-mask stuff isn't just rooted in bigotry and racism, although we've got that in spades. It's also based on the fact that we opened the kimono to the community, and when parents could see over the shoulders of their kids what school looked like, they want no part of it anymore. And so I'm worried. I'm deeply concerned. I'm optimistic. I'll announce it here for the first time. Constructing Modern Knowledge is coming back in July 2022. We had to take 2 years off due to COVID. We're changing geographic location. We're moving to the exciting metropolis of Chattanooga, Tennessee, July 25th to 28th, and trying to recreate what I like to think of as the kind of Cirque du Soleil of professional learning experiences. That's so extra, that's so more than what people typically provide in a way of PD for teachers, that hopefully in a small way, that community can right the ship a little bit. But otherwise, I think we've got a lot of serious problems. And, on a personal note, I've been home for 2 years, been doing some writing, put a book together, but I haven't wanted to sort of react to COVID. I've tried to sort of maintain a consistency in my values, and haven't seen my grandkids in over 2 years, missed half their lives. They live in Shanghai. And I'll say one more thing about, I was part of a webinar with the great educators from Reggio Emilia, Italy, arguably the most important education system in the world. They're referred to by Newsweek as having the best schools in the world. They've got a 50-year tradition, 60-year tradition of complexity and beauty, and focusing on the needs of each child and building everything else around that. And they were at the epicenter of the European coronavirus crisis. And so they had a lot of rebuilding to do. And so I guess this was fall of 2021, they started sharing with the world some of their experiences. And they said that COVID-19 is a dictatorship, and we must obey the dictator to the extent to which we keep the children safe and we do things that are sensible to have the community be responsible. But beyond that, this also demands that we bring more beauty and light and texture and meaning and whimsy and play to our work in order to sort of overcome the forces of darkness that the pandemic has brought. And I know for a fact some of you are in schools that were known for, I'll use your word, innovations, that were the first things that the school packed up and shipped to an offshore location as soon as the virus gave them an excuse to say, yeah, we're done with all that stuff. We can get back to flashcards. Now, there was only one discussion that I heard about education in the media that I thought was reasonable during the pandemic. It was between Chris Hayes of MSNBC and Michelle Goldberg of the New York Times, both New York City public school parents, who said, if education is about childcare, socialization, and academics, we probably could have done 2 of the 3 safely. And we chose to do the one that was impossible. Right? I live in California. I'm wearing a t-shirt. It's been 80 degrees this week. The schools never needed to close if we ran them like summer camps. But instead, we ran them like test prep factories. And we did that online and face-to-face when we returned. I mean, the idea that kids are now still sitting in Zoom in a classroom is something that no one could have ever invented, conjured, imagined.
I think the part of it too has been, there's been a disparity in terms of how well people have been able to do it. I think for me personally, at the school that I was at until last June, I felt like we took care of people well, and we taught online as well as we could with reasonable expectations of it. We weren't having kindergartners online all day, that kind of thing. And I think that teachers didn't have the permission to be creative with how they did it. And so that probably led to, in other places, and I think that may have led to more of the negative aspects that you're referring to. And we keep on talking about, let's reinvent education. Everybody wants to reinvent education, but the mechanisms are not in place to allow that to happen. It seems that we're still fixated on compliance. There's still a lot of bureaucracy in the way. And I don't know of any school district personally, and maybe people in the audience do, where people are really taking into consideration, what have we learned? And how are we going to fix things? And maybe I'm sure people in the audience, like Scott, probably have some ideas on that. But people keep on, there's a lot of talk about this, a lot of lip service, but then the action piece is missing. And so I guess, Gary, I'd be curious as to what your advice would be for teachers, for schools coming out of this, for leadership. What would you advise them to do to kind of regain the good aspects of education?
I think we need to simplify. I think we need to slow down in order to go forward. I think we need to live our values. That was the part of the Reggio Emilia story that I just messed up. I remember coming out of the discussion and being really inspired and saying so on Twitter, let's say. And the immediate responses from everyone was, what are the 6.5, tips they gave for coming back from the pandemic? And I said, they only had one tip, which was live our values. And then sort of a cold chill went down my body, because I recognized that most people, add that to the Proust questionnaire. Why are you a teacher? What's the point of this? And it should fit on a Post-it note, Lucy. I sometimes do an experiment when I'm doing PD with teachers where I ask them to write down the 5 big ideas of what they teach, whether it's a grade level or a specific discipline. And my experience is about 45% of teachers can't get the list down to 5 things, and 45% can't get the list up to 5 things. The sort of, like I said, sort of distilling what it is that we do. Why is it that we show up? I've been telling this story a lot. I went to a high school with 3 blokes who were principal and 2 vice principals. And I can't imagine a scenario. My imagination is not competent enough to conjure a vision of a conversation that I could have had for 30 seconds about learning with those gentlemen. And I think to myself now, I wonder what they think their job was, or what they thought their job was. I want to live in a world where kids wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning with a burning desire to get back to school to work on something that matters to them. And their teachers wake up every morning and ask themselves, how do we make this the best 7 hours of a kid's life? How can we delight in the company of nutty kids? The pandemic's giving us lots of positive affirmation, if we will, of stuff we can get rid of. There are places all over the world that are demonstrating that the test scores not only haven't suffered, they're going up when the kids hadn't been in school. When the pandemic first struck, responsible principals said, don't worry about measurement, just take care of one another. So we can obviously do that, right? So let's continue doing that. I think that once we debunk the hysteria around learning loss, which frankly isn't new or innovative, it's just the Katie Couric segment on a Today Show since time immemorial in June that says, oh my God, your children are going to have what they learned leak out over the summer. We can sort of dispel the leak out theory. That's just, learning loss is just another name for that. The system won't like it when they realize that kids who are sort of healthy socially and mentally and emotionally didn't miss much. Right? If anybody here is a parent who had a kid with a long-term illness, knows this. The kid goes back to school after a week, 2 weeks, a month, and realizes, yeah, I kind of didn't miss anything. My friend, the great software developer of the 80s, Tom Snyder, used to say, if you read the biography of any accomplished human being, you're quite likely to find the sentence "was a sickly child" in their bio. You know, I have a friend who was an early homeschooler, I mean, like decades ago, and he could recite how many days every famous person attended school. And I remember we were talking about one of my boyhood heroes, Thomas Edison, and he said, you know, he only went to 14 days of school. And a colleague of mine replied, well, then he must have had a really good teacher. So, I mean, I think so. So some of the lessons we might have learned from the pandemic is we can get rid of stuff. You know, we can Marie Kondo things that people thought were terribly important that turns out to be not all that important, right? I mean, I personally, the pandemic, you know, moderated some of my ambition and competitiveness. And I think, you know, we're seeing that in a sort of larger sociological scale.
So one of the things you alluded to was CRT and the reaction that's come up with the people who are opposed to it. And I had a conversation today with the head of a nonprofit here in New York about some of the programs that they deliver through that are about human rights, for instance, and even things that are tangentially related or could be construed as being related is causing their teachers that they work with to say, we can't implement these programs. I'm not going to take this program on right now because I'm going to get fired or because parents are going to push back. And I'm really worried. That's really concerning to me that teachers, not only do they feel exhausted and emotionally spent from the past 2 years, but then they also have this fear that is hanging over their heads. And I don't know how we combat that, but I'd love to hear your ideas or any stories you've heard about how this is being approached by schools or individuals.
If there's any group that our society hates more than children, it's teachers. Right. So this is just, this isn't surprising. It's not new. And it's rooted in our history of systemic racism. I think there's proactive stuff we can do. I think we can say hell no. I think we can make it difficult for the people who want to make our lives difficult. I think that we can refuse to fill out the forms of what books are in our classroom, or, you know, submit lesson plans a year in advance and all that kind of bullshit. And I think we should. I mean, I said this in a webinar the other night. I've had the benefit of working in schools and school systems all over the world, where there's a greater appreciation that it's a fundamental human right to withhold one's labor, otherwise you're a slave. And I was working in Australia when the state commissioner of education, minister of education there, said something that merely offended teachers. And the teachers and principals shut the schools down and walked out. He apologized. It didn't happen again. So to a certain extent, I think we need to be a little bit more organized and militant about that. The second thing we need to do is we need to start going to school board meetings ourselves, not just when we get a cookie for being teacher of the month. And people take stuff like, oh, it's illegal in our district. First of all, it's not. But second of all, if it's illegal in the district where you work, then go to school board meetings in a district where you live and you vote. And maybe some of us have to run for school board. And I learned the important lesson. I went to about 500 public school board meetings in North Jersey, which was, you know, like, it was like getting a graduate course into Sopranos. And getting a graduate degree in Sopranos. I went to about 500 meetings between the age of 18 and about 23 because I went away to music school and came home for spring break and read in the newspaper that the fabulous music program that had brought so much richness and beauty and purpose to my life had been voted 9-0 to be eliminated. And 3 days later, I returned to the school board meeting and got the vote reversed, and then formed a nonprofit to make sure it never happened again. And then I got involved in local school board politics. And I remember learning a lesson at 19 years old that if I bring 10 people to a meeting, the board will change its mind on something. It's not that hard. And we should recognize as well that at every level of magnification, from city council to president, there are more teachers in that geographic boundary that can swing an election than any other group. So if we actually just started organizing and defending and voting for our self-interest, it would be best. Now, as for CRT directly, and Don and some of the other folks from independent schools in New York City can probably attest to this. You don't have to do it on camera. I'm not sure schools are capable of doing it well. I think they're so bollock stuff. I don't know if they can deal with complex issues. So maybe we don't deal with complex issues. Maybe we just run PBS films in class. Maybe we just show that. I mean, maybe we go on field trips and we talk about things that were on TV last night, and teach history in this sort of cold way. If we're going to teach it at all, just use primary source documents and let the kids make sense of it. And if we're really concerned about this, I think white and black and brown and Asians and Pacific Islanders and Native Indigenous peoples are going to have to do what those groups have always done, which is maybe we're going to have to start running freedom schools. Maybe we're going to just have to say on Saturday morning, we're going to read W.E.B. Du Bois, or we're going to talk about systemic racism, or we're going to watch these movies. And I mean, I remember feeling cheated when I discovered all the American history that I wasn't taught. And I was pretty well off because I was heavily involved with jazz as a high school kid. And I had two band directors who were working jazz musicians. And we had one of the first jazz programs at a university in the town where I lived back in the 70s. So I learned a lot about racism and race and the contributions of African Americans to American history and society through the music. And I'll just say tangentially, there's no one who played Horace Silver or was Tevye in high school who's shooting up a school or causing an insurrection. And if we're concerned about our democracy, we should be doubling down on those kinds of activities as well. But I think it's really difficult, and I'm not sure that schools who struggle to teach anything are, at least right now, in a great position to deal with complex issues. And it only gets worse when schools that are entirely built on caste preservation and segregation are engaged in this what's the Japanese, this active I'm sorry, this sort of kabuki theater of pretending that you're now deeply concerned about people that you would never have over for dinner or provide financial aid for or admit to your school. So maybe we need to take a break from some of it and go more subversive. Or like I said, just, there's stuff on PBS every night that does a better job than any curriculum you can embrace. And we certainly don't want to become a self-parody of trying to find diverse ways of teaching polynomials. And, a lot of it has really looked dopey, and the public has responded to that because they smell a rat.
So tell us a little bit about your new book, and I'm curious about it. I just bought it. I haven't looked at it in all honesty, but I will. And I would love to know more about it's a compilation of work from different people, correct?
Yes. The book is 20 Things to Do with a Computer, Forward 50, Future Visions of Education, inspired by Seymour, Papert, and Cynthia Solomon's seminal work. It ties together a lot of the things that we've been talking about, that I think that if we want to improve education, we want to make the world a better place for kids and teachers, the first thing we should do as a society is find the cure for amnesia. We should recognize that we stand on the shoulders of giants, that we know stuff. I actually heard Bill Clinton tell an education conference once, every problem in education has been solved somewhere before. Because, you know, if you're struggling with what to do as a school leader and you just don't know where to start, swing by my house. I got a couple thousand books I'll lend you that'll tell you how to start. I curate a lot of materials online, whether it's my archive of Seymour Papert's work, or I've collected a lot of early progressive education films and seminal documents that are important. My friends Seymour Papert and Cynthia Solomon in 1971 wrote a paper called 20 Things to Do with a Computer. And the paper was extraordinary in a lot of ways. At the most superficial level, it predicted the computer as a constructive medium. It talked about every child programming their own computer at a time where most adults had never even seen one. It talked about every child having a computer and owning their own personal computer. And I should say, parenthetically, that if we had lived our values and if we had recognized the shoulders on which we stood, and if we had learned any of the lessons of history, those of us who had been dismissed as utopians and reckless spenders who had this preposterous idea of children having personal computers 32 years ago, if we had learned any of those lessons, when the machines miraculously descended from the heavens during the pandemic, we might have had an alternative vision for how to use them rather than doing, school in a box. And Papert and Solomon also in 1971 predicted the maker movement in excruciating detail. So there was that. And what's interesting about the 20 Things to Do with the computer paper is not only did they predict the next 50 years of educational computing or educational technology, but they say quite explicitly in the paper, these are things we've already done in classrooms with elementary children. So I often remark that if your school is looking for a tech plan, you might as well use this one from 1971. It does the job quite nicely. And most of your schools, no matter how much you spend on IT or professional development, couldn't achieve the aspirations of this 50-year-old document. I thought it was important to try to sustain the legacy of Papert and Solomon by assembling this book. And then I thought about how to do it. So we have the folks who were there in the 70s and 80s, who changed the world, who did the hard work, who created the software, who were engaged in the educational research, who thought about how children could learn, how computers not just teach kids things that we've always wanted them to learn with greater efficiency and efficacy and comprehension, stickiness, but to create opportunities for kids to learn and do in ways that were unimaginable just a couple of years ago, that we could use the computer to amplify the potential of each child and as an intellectual laboratory and vehicle for self-expression. So we have those folks, people like Dan Watt and Molly Watt and Ken Kahn and Jose Valente, and Tom Lowe and David Thornburg, who brought these ideas into the mainstream. Dan Watt wrote a book in 1983 called Learning with Logo that sold 100,000 copies. Now, just sort of ponder that for a moment. There was a book for teachers on how to teach computer programming to children in 1983 that sold 100,000 copies. There hasn't been a book in educational technology that sold like that since, with very few exceptions. And so we were doing grand aspirational stuff. So I thought it was important to have their sort of historic perspective involved. And then we had academics who have invented things and conducted research, and teachers who are doing brilliant work today from around the world with technology in their classrooms in the spirit of Papert and Solomon's vision. And then we sort of posit what that might look like for the next 50 years. So we had more than 4 dozen contributors. I'm not upset that you haven't read the book yet, because one of my goals was that it will be read for the next 50 years, that will celebrate the last half century and provide inspiration for the next. I think that Papert and Solomon are the bridge between John Dewey and Stephen Wolfram, the Reggio Emilia approach in synthetic biology, mud pies and computational thinking, computer science for all, and Piaget. So I wanted it not just be about computers in the classroom, but to say that the most effective vision for using stuff that has a battery in it or plugs into the wall is to do so within a progressive continuum, and to build upon those progressive traditions by making those connections quite explicit. So, we've got Sugata Mitra's in the book, and Audrey Waters, and a lot of my heroes. And it's been fun over the last month. We've done 5 book study discussions online where I was able to share the people I learned how to teach teachers from, and about what was important with a new generation of educators. And I'll just say one more thing, and we can talk about the innovation stuff or save it for another conversation because it's a whole other topic. But I was deeply moved by 75 to 92-year-old educators who came online in Zoom for 5 sessions to celebrate an aha moment that some nutty 4th grader had in 1984. And if you want to know what the purpose of education is, it's that. It's creating those memories, not just for the kids, but for those teachers as well. And Alice Adcock, who I hadn't seen literally in decades, who I'm told is 92 years old, figured out how to scan a learning inventory that she created for watching kids program and being able to report up the chain of command what the kids obviously demonstrated they understood how to do, not just in sort of computer science terms, but more broader into thinking and learning terms, that she created as part of an action research community in the mid-1980s. So a lot of my work at this point is based on the lessons of heroes of mine like Jimmy Heath, the great jazz saxophonist, who liked to say what was good is good. And showing people what's possible, whether it's brand new or not, because much of what's being sold as brand new either isn't new or isn't good.
I'm taking tonight. I'm having dinner with a former student of mine that lives here in New York, and he's one of the kids that went through the Generation Yes program when I had it at my school. And I think I will find out tonight, but like, he stayed in touch because we had those magic moments as a group, and those kinds of things have carried him. I'm guessing he's now an engineer at Google. And I can't wait to hear his story and how his journey has been, and what made him, what stuck with him as a student. It'll be really interesting to see. I haven't talked to him in 10 years.
You just said, yeah,
see what that is.
And you just said something important that I think that Carlo Rinaldi, who runs the Reggio Emilia Foundation, has spoken about, that it's important to learn as a group. It's more important to learn as a group than in a group. And if you think about things like Generation Yes, how painfully simple that idea was, and yet how incredibly hard it is to sustain. In education, good ideas are incredibly fragile, and bad ones are timeless and impervious to geographic boundaries. And the internet has only exacerbated that. When I started working in Australia in 1990, I loved the first few years where they were 10 years behind the incredibly stupid policies of United States education. And then like everyone got connected via the web, and they're minutes behind our stupidity now. Because the idea, all of a sudden Joel Klein was a national leader of thought, and so yeah, I mean, and anyone who teaches knows that you have to teach in all directions at all times. You have to teach the kids that are assigned to you. You have to teach your colleagues, you teach your administrators, teach the idiot on the bus next to you. That if your school is committed to authentic assessment, you can't be one and done. You have to have ongoing parent education about that, because over time people will forget. So the mission is ongoing, and I think like I said, identifying your core values and then trying to be consistent in actuating them and living them is really important. And it's okay. This is a line often attributed to Seymour Papert. I think his student Edith Harrell is actually responsible for it. But they said that it's okay as a teacher to worry about what you're going to do Monday, as long as what you do Monday points in the direction of what you hope to do someday. And a lot of what we're doing in the pandemic has demonstrated that when we just react to crises, crises du jour, real or imagined, we make compromises. Those aren't compromises. They tend to be detours that take us away from what our mission is and from accomplishing the goals that we would otherwise hope to achieve.
So does anybody want to grab the mic and ask Gary a question? And if not, I'll let anybody jump in. But Gary, to the point of, while we're waiting for people to kind of gather their thoughts, the idea about innovation, I think, from Don and I can only speak for myself, is really, for us, it's not about doing things better. It's about doing things better and redesigning and figuring out complex problems. Whereas it's not necessarily reinventing the wheel, but it could be. And so we're interested in, part of developing this professional learning community is for people who are interested in at least expanding our universe in terms of what we know and thinking critically about where we're going in education. That's kind of the whole purpose of this. So we're not talking about that throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're talking about how do we do things better, and learn from other people who are doing really interesting work in this area.
This could just be a semantic debate, but I think it's actually it's maybe more than that, maybe more subtle than that. And I'd love to, let's just have that discussion at some point, because I have some thoughts about it. I mean, yeah, let me just leave it at that. I mean, I think that it's the wrong objective with perverse incentives.
Okay.
But I think, it's important to have discussions, and we live in an age of monologues. Education is, dissent is viewed as defect. And I can't tell you the number of conferences that have refused to put 2 chairs on a stage. And so we get TED Talks, and people are building a career on the fact that they did a TED Talk. Well, big deal. I did 4 of them. I despise them. I think these conversations are important. And it was one of the reasons why I put together the 20 Things book, because I don't know if the educational technology community can articulate what it's about. And a couple of the essays that I wrote in the book are talking about how what technology is for has shifted dramatically in education over the last couple decades. And those discussions aren't being had. And I'll put this in the form of a question for you. Why do you think it is that there's been so little interest in, plug the book again, in this new book from the EdTech community? Now as readers, but I cast a wide net. I asked a lot of people to contribute, who I thought were intelligent and had something to say, and whether I agreed with them or not. Not everything in the book is stuff that I agree with. But the educational technology community seems, sadly, to be, again, in Papert's words, idea averse.
I would say
And
that 10,
I'm not sure
10,
what to do about that.
I think 10 or 15 years ago, we were having those discussions. We were together, we were learning from each other. And I think it's become very separated. I think it's become competitive in some ways for people, for consulting, for books, for things that are not particularly authentic. And we've gone away from what drew us all together. I'd say at EduBloggerCon in 2006, or at EduCon at SLA, at the Science Leadership Academy. A lot of us got together and had those discussions there that were about that were more authentic and more rooted in progressive practices. And we haven't had those kinds of opportunities or maybe we've all gotten to know each other too well and have decided to go our own ways. But there, when you say the EdTech community, I'm not sure if there is an EdTech community. I think there's an EdTech marketing community. But where and it really should, I would hope it would be an education community first and foremost, rather than an EdTech. EdTech is in the service of teaching and learning.
Completely agree. And I mean, it's always made me uncomfortable that the word industry was bandied about, that people freely said, I'm part of this industry, where I assure you, there's no other education conference you go to that feels that vulgar or crass. And when you think about innovation, it's easy to be innovative in education. When I was working with the first laptop schools in the world, the schools across the street got in a newspaper by announcing, hell no, we're not doing that, even though they knew it was the right thing to do. There were schools that had laptops in the early 90s who flew to Japan and told the executives at Toshiba, hey, you could really help us out here if you would raise the price of the laptops, because then the other schools couldn't afford to have them. And then we could continue to be innovators. And then there would be other schools that would say, well, our innovation is we shook the vendor down and got the laptops for 5 cents cheaper than you got them. And so it was no longer about anything other than sort of meaningless competition or press releases or bragging rights. And I will just say the part that I missed the most is that when I got involved in educational computing in the early 1980s, it's where the smartest, most radical educators in the world were assembled. And I'm using the word radical deliberately because Seymour Papert fought apartheid with Mandela before Mandela went to prison. Most of the folks who were involved in Logo were involved in the civil rights movement and women's rights movement and anti-war movement. And then there was this period of progressive education in the 70s that was rooted in principles, and that what we did with computers was seen as a way of amplifying those ideas. It breaks my heart that fire seems to have been extinguished. And you may be right that it may just be a symptom of the polarization, bifurcation, and fragmentation of every other aspect of society. But I think it's time to I think this is a time to re-up it. And I think that's what we're trying to do here a little bit and a very small thing is let's reconnect again. Let's get back to the roots of why we enjoyed working in this field or industry, as you don't want to say. I think that's part of it. The other thing I want to add to this, last week we had Katan and Manish Katharian, who invented AlphaSmart and have done a couple other startups over the years. And one of the things that I took away from our conversation was that they always had teachers. They knew that they were not teachers. They knew that they were engineers by trade, and they honored teachers. They included teachers in the development process of things like that. And I think that's something, and you can say whatever, I'm sure you can find room for criticism with EdTech industry, but I think that those conversations between the two groups are few and far between. And, EdSurge did these summits a long time ago that were great, where they brought people together to kind of teachers to give feedback and that sort of thing. But there really isn't any other mechanism for everyday teachers who are doing the work to connect with the industry and have conversations. And then the other thing I'll add to that too is that I couldn't find it the other day. I was looking for it. Audrey Waters had this great post about what industry people should know about education a number of years ago. I cannot find it. I don't know if she took it down or what. It was fabulous. And it went through this whole list of things that you should know about if you're working in that industry in order to really understand our field. It is the top of the hour. It's a crummy business. Selling to schools is a crummy business. So people are increasingly desperate. But I'm not that interested in that. I mean, I'm interested in the fact that after over 100 often closed by the fire marshal sessions at ISTE and NET conferences over 33 years, that the half dozen completely disparate proposals that I submitted this year and last were rejected. And get a sort of talk to the hand when I raise questions about transparency and about mission. And so it only saddens me that a community that I think I had a role in, that I signed the ISTE charter, I actually have a copy of it, that I've supported with my own work and time and money. I've spent $60,000 to $100,000 over the years speaking at ISTE conferences for free. No longer feels at home in the community that I was part of for so long.
And I remember seeing you in San Antonio in my first ISTE or NEC, and I was pregnant with Henry, who's now 19. And I remember you criticizing NEC, and I was like, oh my gosh, he's speaking at this conference and he's criticizing it. Like, I had no idea what was involved or anything. I was a teacher and new to the whole world. But yeah, I think that there's, if we are in the name of diversity, inclusivity and equity too, I think there's something about making sure that all voices are heard. And part of that is listening to the history of things as well. It is now.
Can I say one more thing about the inclusivity, diversity thing very quickly? Very quickly. Leroy Finkel was one of the people who created Q. He was one of the leaders, one of the founding fathers of educational computing. And he died very young tragically with cancer. And right before his death, we became friends. We'd known each other for a long time. And Linda Poland and I and a couple other people in California got Leroy deeply interested in the fact that the California Q conference looked like an apartheid rally, pro-apartheid rally, as do most EdTech conferences, as do most education conferences, that they tend to be all white. And we decided to start speaking about it. And we had panels about it, including Leroy's last public appearance before he passed. And then we put a fellowship, his family put aside some money for a fellowship to encourage diversity. And that award now is given to white guys. And there's no historical record of it. And I remember being at the ISTE conference in Seattle in the lobby with the half dozen African Americans who came every year, who had been promised year after year after year a seat at the table and had been shushed again. And they were up in arms in the lobby. And we had to I became an honorary member of the, ISTE Black Caucus. These issues have been with us for a long time. They've been persistent and they've not gotten better.
So here's what I suggest. It's now 3, it's a little bit after 3 here in New York. And I want to, if Gary, if you want to stick around, we can continue the conversation. Are you busy? Do you have a hard stop?
I'm here.
Okay. If everybody else needs to go, you can. We're going to keep going. We'd love to have you. Stick around and yeah. And let's have this doesn't have to be between me and Gary. I'd like everybody else to jump in too. So let's have a little bit more free form going here. Who wants to add their 2 cents? And if you have to go, that's totally fine. But I'm happy to keep talking. Don, do you have any thoughts you want to add?
No, but Gary, you said, why do you think the EdTech community seems sadly idea-verse? I think it's because they're not interested in ideas, they're interested in solutions. That's what they're about. And there's a lot of confusion with those 2 things. And I find that's the same with a lot of schools. They're not interested in ideas, they just want solutions. They don't want to navigate the ambiguity. They want the out of the box, here it is, and it's just shocking to me. I'm still that naive with that belief system,
Well, there's some just very quickly, there's some governance problems. ISTE is a membership organization. It shouldn't be concerned with the needs of vendors at all. And they don't recognize that you can't be on both teams' sides. Sometimes they line up, but sometimes the industry is oppositional to the mission of the members. Mark has his hand up. He's figured out how to raise his hand, so we should call on him.
Hey, Gary, it's really great to see you again.
Thanks, mate.
We've met a few times here in the Bay Area. I agree with a lot of what you said about the EdTech community being idea averse. Being here in Silicon Valley for a long time, it seems that the EdTech movement, not the EdTech industry, has become co-opted by the .com industry. It's all about making money. Teachers who are brought in by EdTech companies are really being brought in for sales. To sell to other teachers. They're brought in because of their educational chops. But my question is really more along the lines of, I'm not going to use the word innovation. I'm going to use the word progressive education. Do you think we've suffered a progressive education loss?
Yes, of course we have. But in order to suffer a loss, you have to know we had it. We had something in the first place. So a lot of my work is around.
I'm
let's
sitting
say that
here in a school makerspace. This is a public school makerspace paid for by a public school district. So there has been some movement forward. Do you think?
Oh, absolutely. And the reason why we wrote, Invent to Learn, which is in English here and in Kyrgyz there, and it's published in 9 languages now, was to use the makerspace as a Trojan horse. The interest in the makerspace, to use it as a Trojan horse to reignite interest in progressive education, to show through the eyes and the hands and the screens of the kids what was possible, in order to have a much more broader discussion about the nature of teaching and learning. It was really easy for schools to come up with the money for the room and the space. Sometimes they just had to put a Post-it note on the door and announce the day of makerspace. And people like Tracy Rositas, who's here, who was in a New York City public school, her entire makerspace was in, a couple tubs, and it happened during lunch every day. And it was some of the most brilliant work I've ever seen. But I will say, to use this sort of negative example again, which I don't want to be so negative or contrarian, but I encountered schools that were telling me they were spending $25 million on a makerspace. And my sense of that is, if you're spending $25 million on a makerspace, your goal isn't progressive education, it's crushing the school down the street. It's marketing. And what happens in that makerspace won't be as easy to sustain over time as schools that have sort of embedded it in a richer educational context that was based on meaning and vision.
It's about the support of the people behind it. And we've been fortunate enough to have a series of administrators here who do support it. I like to call it subverting from within.
Yeah, mazel tov. I mean, Freire said you keep your, I want to get this right, your strategic leg outside of the system and your tactical leg inside of the system.
Yeah.
Right. So, as soon as Obama started having maker fairs and people started talking about this as being a way of, juicing the economy and producing jobs, well, that was a really good way to get some of this stuff back into schools. But I will say, it's remarkable to me the alacrity with which schools packed it up when COVID hit, as opposed to thinking about, hey, I could put a micro bit and some alligator clips and an LED in an envelope and mail it to every kid, and they can have their own makerspace, and we can continue these wonderful learning adventures. Instead, they went, let's move on to the next thing. Enough of that.
All right, I'll let somebody else talk. I got kids coming. I gotta go.
Go.
The idea of spending $20 million on a makerspace is ridiculous, because I think every kid at home has a makerspace. You don't even need to send them anything. That's the fun of the makerspace, is that you take something that's like at home already
and repurpose it.
Make something that, yeah. So I think that was a missed opportunity to be really creative with kids at home, and they could have done that during Zoom. I mean, yeah.
Our Constructing Modern Knowledge this year is going to be hosted in a brand new state-of-the-art decadent fab lab on a college campus. And I've already said to my faculty, and we're going to struggle mightily not to use half the stuff, because we want the focus to be on the whimsy and the joy and the discovery and the personal expression. And what we find is that, okay, now if you want to use a CNC machine or a laser cutter or a 3D printer, that's in service of the larger goal, and it becomes trivial compared to what, your larger mission.
Absolutely.
Jim, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I'd love to get Gary's historical view of science. I've been
Oh,
a
I saw your
STEM
question.
I've been a STEM education advocate for my entire career, and now last 19 years I've been teaching teachers science. I'm intrigued by the fact that in the 70s we had hands-on science, and then it vanished, and then in the 90s the Smithsonian helped to bring it back, and Goals 2000 helped to bring it back, and now it vanished again, and now we've got NGSS, which I love and I struggle with, but I'm curious, from your point of view, how do we get back to this progressive, inquiry-based, constructivist approach to science?
So it's a big topic. And I should, if you email me, I'll try to find you the article. I was interviewed by some like Cub reporter a few years ago about like, do you think STEM is good? These sort of like, questions like a second grader would ask, should we do STEM? And I decided to actually take the question seriously and write responses. And I can't remember how my careful responses offhand, but I'll share a couple of ideas. One is that, again, we suffer. You mentioned the amnesia. I've been trying to find some of the documents from the elementary science study of the 1960s and 70s. And they might as well be, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The stuff is, I can't get my hands on them. And I've been telling everyone, I recently bought a fairly expensive book scanner because I'm scanning a lot of the stuff that I own and can find to put my hands on and making it available for educators so that we can remember these things. So if anyone has the elementary science study mealworms unit, I want it bad. And I'll scan it. And then I think it comes back to our argument and our discussion about semantics. STEM is kind of silly, and then STEAM is even sillier, and then STREAM is just bordering on ridiculous. And why don't we just call it Abkadeki Jekyll Knocker Stoics? I mean, that we create these acronyms that mean absolutely nothing. And while sort of they may make a great press release, but there's no action behind them. So if we're serious about STEM, I think the part that's new and different is engineering and computing. I did a talk last week that I called Putting the C Back into STEM, mostly to sort of make fun of this. But I think that the future is computational, and I have an essay called that in the new book. Stephen Wolfram, arguably the most important living mathematician, scientist, computer scientist, says that for any field X, there is already or soon will be a computational X. From art or archaeology to zoology, there's some branch of that field that's been dramatically influenced, impacted, transformed by computation. And that not only represents the vanguard of that field or the branch of that discipline, but the better paying branch of it as well. So if your concerns are only your kids getting better jobs, then we'd be taking that seriously. And the thing about computing and engineering is, unlike science and math, they're words, they're verbs. They're things we do. So I think that's important, and it's worth recognizing, again, these patterns. The Next Generation Science Standards has really wonderful principles, and then people either dismiss them, ignore them, argue about them, and what they do is they then go to the appendix where it has the 7,000 facts you're supposed to know, and that's the part that they focus on, as opposed to children being mathematicians rather than being taught math, being scientists rather than being taught science, being historians rather than being taught history. I'll mention that I haven't announced this anywhere either. I'm taking a flyer, and I invited a guest speaker for Constructing Modern Knowledge this summer named Kate Schuster, who's been getting some press recently for something called the Hard History Project, that she's helping university libraries and archives and museums bring primary source materials primarily around historical topics and around controversial topics like race and slavery to classrooms. And I think, again, that's to come back to the CRT issue of, like, if you make all these slave diaries available to fourth graders and you suggest creative things that they can do with them as a historian, with the sort of lens of a historian, then they'll start understanding race and racism and American history and our white supremacy and stuff in a more organic, meaningful, personal way, without us, announcing we're teaching systemic racism and stuff like that. So I see that as a piece. So I think that Neil Postman said in the 60s, we need highly attuned crap detectors.
Yeah.
Right. And so, so the reason why I want the mealworm unit is because this was a unit from the 60s where kids could understand life and reproduction and life cycles and colonization and a million other biological phenomena with low cost, icky mealworms. And then in the 80s, there were memos about how you could program these. And then, now we have all kinds of modeling tools for being able to transform this experience and broaden it. And it'd be nice to be able to make all those kinds of connections, to involve all those different senses in some unit of inquiry that we think is important. I'm not a big fan of inquiry either. I'll put that on the list of words I don't use. Because I think schools like talking and they like answering questions or asking questions and regurgitating information. And, talk is cheap. I'm a lot more interested in action. One of the challenges of translating Invent to Learn in other languages is the subtitle is Making, Tinkering, and Engineering in the Classroom. And there are some languages that don't have any ing words in them. Like it was really difficult to translate even just the title into Spanish. I'm not a linguist, but I was just told that there's no tinkering or this anyway.
So
I think Bobby wanted, Bobby's.
Hi, Bobby.
Hi, Bobby. I wished I'd been in Italy with you. I'm not sure how much teaching you did, but you ate a lot of gelato from looking at your picture.
And lost weight. I lost weight in Italy.
But I wished I'd been there. I think going back to several comments before about the loss of this community of people that we all talked about and were part of and knew, I think I've been studying for a long time, for the last 10, 12 years, what this new ecosystem needs to look like. And somebody mentioned, teachers are going into EdTech and they're ending up in sales and not pedagogy and strategy and thinking. I think the issue is that we have the wrong ecosystem and that we need to change the ecosystem around this thinking. And it needs to include researchers, educators, investors, and the entrepreneurs. And right now they all four work in silos. And even if we look at what happened during COVID, we weren't don't get me started on higher ed and educational research, but we weren't changing our research to look at what was happening and understand the changes that were happening because of COVID. And even if they were doing the research on it, nobody was sharing that with the people that could implement it and change what's going on. So, or the entrepreneurs were building products that had solutions, but not any problem they were solving. Can't tell you how many companies I look at and get every week. And I say to the entrepreneur, well, this is a great solution, but I'm not sure what problem it's going to solve. So I think that the problem is that the ecosystem needs to change. The community has the wrong people in it. And even when you go to like the GSV meeting or to go to the ISTE meeting, they claim they're bringing this mix of people together, but they're not. You go to GSV and the only people there are investors looking to invest in the next great thing, entrepreneur. The teachers aren't there unless they happen to be the entrepreneur, but that's about it. They claim they're inviting them, but you have 6,000 people and 4 superintendents, or some disproportionate amount of people. So I think you're right to say it's the community you've lost, but we haven't figured out what the new community should look like.
Yeah, a few thoughts. I mean, I just wrote down, and you inspired a new idea that they're not solving problems; they're problem causing sometimes. Right? We've got a whole problem causing community. It's interesting when you talk about sharing research and not sharing research. It's kind of funny. There was a lot of research being shared. That's why we have a vaccine. Just no one else was sharing research. And it's funny when schools talk about preparing kids for the real world, they almost always mean something really terrible, or they have some cartoon notion of the real world. Alfie Kohn calls it the better get used to it curriculum. if you wonder why 5th grade is miserable, because you won't believe what 6th grade is like. Or they have this idea that the world is a place where, mom and dad wake up at 7 a.m. Mom woke up at 6 a.m. so she could cook breakfast for the family. And dad puts on a suit and tie and a hat, and mom hands him a lunch pail and kisses him on the forehead, and he goes off to the office. That world doesn't exist either. My youngest kid, who first of all was an art major and has been fully employed since the moment she graduated university. Schools aren't telling kids that, but she could also write and code and speak and read. But she now has a job that not only doesn't have an office to go to, there is none, and she has unlimited vacation time.
Yeah, well, that's true of most companies. And when you look, that's another example of where we're looking at what changes need to be made as we look at the great resignation, of which my son was just part of on purpose. I mean, he just left the workforce.
But you're talking about learning lessons, right? So if we were going to make a curriculum based on the real world, what would a curriculum look like in which the real world gives you unlimited vacation time? What impact would that have on the school schedule?
And the curriculum, I agree with you, Gary, but the curriculum is all wrong. We used to write curriculum because we had a set of standards. We wrote the curriculum to assess it. Now we've theoretically changed the way we need to assess kids. Well, that's a whole nother session, but let's assume we haven't changed the curriculum, or we haven't changed the what they have to be tested on. So we are stuck in, even if we have creative curriculum, we still need to assess whether it's working or not working. And we have to change how we do that.
I'm using curriculum too narrowly there.
Yeah.
But the reason you can have a job with unlimited vacation time is there's an expectation you get your work done.
Right. And
that it matters to you. So in that world, do we need to be talking about time on task? Do we need to be talking about third period? Do we need to be, right? So big structural changes that all I'm saying is, if schools are really concerned about the real world, they would at least even take a look at what the real world is.
So why don't we take the real world and put it in the school? That's my biggest issue.
Well, I'll give you an example. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
So the thing I remember the most from my education, my elementary school education, is when somebody came from the community and came into the classroom and talked about something really cool that was in the real world that they did, whether it was Mr. Friendly, the policeman, or the grandmother who was the Holocaust survivor. I mean, those are the things that take the real world and they put them in the classroom. It could be parents, it could be anyone, but it's like, you put kids in a silo in a school that's complete. You take them out of the real world and you put them in a box and you try to teach them how to live in the real world, but you just took them out of the world that you're trying to teach them how to live in. So it just, to me, it seems like we need to start bringing the outside world into the classroom, or the kids out of the classroom and into the real world for them to actually learn something practical.
So let's talk about the low-hanging fruit. So I completely agree with you. The stuff that I remember from what was otherwise a fairly miserable schooling experience was, the telephone company gave every classroom a telephone, and there were like little scripts and activities in the imaginative play area for learning how to communicate on a telephone. And I get calls from my friends who teach at universities who talk about phoning a student and the student answering yup, and being just sort of outraged that that's how you're talking to a university professor on the phone. So like maybe like playing with the telephones, when the local newspaper used to bring newspapers to the classroom, and there would be a month where we learned to read the newspaper. Maybe we would have a better approach towards anti-science and misinformation and the other stuff if we were doing those kinds of things. I mean, let me bring in a technological example of this, where I don't think that our actions even begin to match our rhetoric. The dumbest, lowest level, low-hanging fruit of using technology in the classroom goes something like this. Kids can talk to NASA scientists, right? We've heard variations on that theme for decades now. So at some point, we have to demand Is that possible? Do kids have email accounts at school? Are they allowed to use them? Can an expert zoom into a classroom? I taught an entire semester in Alabama last year via Zoom. The kids were unallowed to share their screens with me. You ever teach programming to kids when you can't see their screens? I felt like I was being punked because some IT guy decided that that's not allowed, or so it's preposterous. So we can't even make the simple things easy to do. I mean, I've been asking ISTE for 25 years for a standard that says what a child should be able to do when they turn on a computer. What's the minimum expectation for what this thing in front of you should be capable of? Should they have an email address? Should they be able to, should it be two-way? We won't even have that discussion. And I'll just share something that's present and futuristic as well. So I was preparing a talk that I gave during the height of the pandemic, and I was thinking about the incredible generosity of experts during the pandemic. And this was another thing that I think was really important that shaped my thinking, and I'll come back to this, is I'm doing a lot of thinking these days about generosity and grace. And it's stuff that I'm personally working on. You may not see any evidence of that, but I'm personally working on it and struggling with it. And I'm thinking about one of the qualities of great teachers is their generosity. And, Chick Corea practiced on Facebook at a random time every day for a few months before he died. And anyone who sort of was watching him would know that it would pop up, and you could watch one of the greatest musicians of the last century practice in front of you. And occasionally he would take some questions. There have been any number of examples of experts who've been willing to share their expertise via the web or in person during this period or any other, because people who are great at what they do care that it continues. They want their tradition to be built upon. They want to embrace young people who are interested in what they're interested in. So I mentioned Stephen Wolfram before. Wolfram, who was a MacArthur genius at 18 or 19, had a PhD around the same time, has created the software that every mathematician and scientist and engineer in the world uses, has announced a couple of years ago that he has a new theory of physics. And he's the kind of guy who, when he makes statements like that, people sit up and take notice. And he doesn't just bloviate, he provides all of his data, the tools that he uses for testing his theory, et cetera, makes it freely available to anyone who wants to participate. As of about a week or two ago, he had done more than 80 Ask Me Anything sessions on science, technology, mathematics for kids, where for hours at a time, the Sir Isaac Newton, the Stephen Hawking, the Albert Einstein of our age, has lent his talents and expertise to anyone who's interested in talking to him about subjects he cares about. That's not in the next generation science standards. Are we taking advantage of that? And I found I wanted a visual to use in a presentation I gave, and I stumbled upon a YouTube video which was a recording of a live coding session he did in February 2020 with children, where they were looking at the reproduction of the SARS coronavirus 19. And I looked at the date and I thought to myself, holy cow, this is about a month before the United States was acknowledging it. There were thousands of deaths, not millions. It would be ridiculous to suggest that if more fourth graders had been working with Wolfram to look at the spread of coronavirus data, that we might have found a vaccine sooner or something like that. It's not ridiculous to suggest that we would have less anti-science sentiment in the public square. And so, at the very least, why don't we just avail ourselves of the stuff that exists? I've been trying to teach a course, Bobby, find somewhere for me to do this. I've written a syllabus for a course called Watch More TV, Teach Better. There are unbelievable examples, positive and negative, of fabulous teaching and learning just in reality television. If we said to the kids during the pandemic, Watch 5 things on television and tell us what you learned from them. It might have been better than making Bitmoji classrooms and Zoom detention. Because there's like really, I can't keep up with all the stuff that you could learn from that box that's in every house already, or that's in your hand. Now that's more passive than I would like education to be, but that's why we have schools, because school is the place where you democratize access to experience and expertise. This is the equalizer where you say, oh, you don't have a makerspace? We've got one here. You don't have an orchestra at home? Join ours. That's what keeps school viable, is being a place where kids can be introduced to things they don't yet know they love, and where they can become good at something, because we could provide, a more democratic access to experience and expertise.
That's it in a nutshell. And I think that we've forgotten the purpose of school, like what you just said, and we need to remind people that's why they exist, and that's why we're here, and that joy is what we're
the stuff that gives me purpose and meaning and joy, that kept me sane through the pandemic and through the toughest times of my life, were things that I was introduced to at a public middle school in Wayne, New Jersey. I learned to compose music. I learned to fall in love with jazz and classical music. I learned how to program computers. And one of the reasons why I'm, dismissed as being passionate or opinionated is because I'll be goddamned if I'll be responsible for depriving another generation of kids of equally rich experiences.
I think that's the perfect way to end, because that's going to be my mantra. I'm going to stop recording